This is my final project for my EPQ, and the topic that I will be discussing is racial stereotypes, and I hope you enjoy the video, and afterwards I would like you to complete the questionnaire, but I'll talk about that more at the end of the video. Stereotypes are mental representations that amplify the differences between groups, especially when groups are similar. Stereotypical thinking is usually an overreaction to information, which is where negative racial stereotypes come from, because they usually focus on the characteristics which aren't as flattering. If stereotypes don't change, people ignore new information that's given to them about the characteristic that people are stereotyping, which often leads to people just full-blown ignoring them and still thinking the same way about a certain group of people when it's obviously not true. Racial stereotypes are constructed beliefs that all members of the same race share given characteristics. Most of these stereotypes are seen as negative because most of them are linked to the slave trade or racist attitudes towards black people, and they are usually well-defined characteristics. Before I continue the video, I want to give you a question for you to think about throughout the video as I give you more information, and I want you to form your own opinion and answer for. And the question is, to what extent do black racial stereotypes still affect not only the older generation but the younger generation as well? The first topic I will be discussing is negative stereotypes of African Americans created in America. Most of these are linked to the slave trade, and they're quite horrible as well, as they really focus on the negative characteristics that are made up that were given to black people post-slave trade. The first two are Jim Crow and the Sambo, and these are very much based on the slave trade. Jim Crow was where the first origins of blackface came from, and he was the happy male slave, and he was also seen as inept, so he had to be told what to do all the time because he really couldn't think for himself. And the Sambo was the happy slave as well. He was a jolly overgrown child that was also seen as lazy. So as much as that he was happy to serve his master, he couldn't think for himself and couldn't be bothered to do it, and had to be told what to do all the time by his slave master. This portrayed the weak image of black males in particular, because they were then seen to not being able to think for themselves. The next example is the Savage, and that originated from a movie called Birth of a Nation, in which the KKK tamed the terrifying savage African American through lynching, and the message that was portrayed through the movie was "we must put blacks in their place or else," which justified the violence towards black people around that time, which you still see not as much as probably about 30 years ago or 40 years ago, but you still see the resemblance. You still see things like the KKK and groups like that, and that's one of the biggest stereotypes that would still exist and still has an effect today. The next example is Mammy, who is a masculine woman with pitch black skin, and she treated her white masters with respect but was a tyrant towards her own family and dominated her husband and children with her temper. This contributed to the negative stereotype of black people, because if a male was seen to be dominated by a female, it wasn't seen as being able to take control of situations by yourself, which made the male stereotype of the black man become even weaker than it was because of Jim Crow and Sambo. And this also didn't help the female side of black people, because the Mammy made people think that she was just a masculine version of a woman, and she had a temper, she was aggressive, and she also wasn't seen as any competition to white women because she was an unsexual being. She was masculine, she didn't look like a woman. The next example is Jezebel, who was seen as the harlot and represented the sexual side of African American women. She was light-skinned and a mulatto, and she was slender, had long hair and small features, and the creation of Jezebel justified the white man to not take responsibility for the rape and sexual abuse of African American women. And as much as this stereotype isn't as bad as it is today, you still see it in the media with people who have light skin fetishes, or people not even that far, but people who see lighter skinned people as more beautiful than darker skinned girls, which just is not true. Racial stereotypes can also be represented and shown in the series, whether that be fictional or non-fictional, and whether that be written or shown on TV. And the first example I'm going to talk about is When They See Us, which is a docu-series on Netflix, which is really moving, and it's about the Central Park Five, who are 5 boys aged between 14 and 16 who were accused of the rape and attempted murder of Trisha Maylee, who was a 28-year-old white woman. The 5 boys were either black or Hispanic, and their names were Kevin Richardson, who was 14, Raymond Santana Jr., who was also 14, Antron McRae, who was 15, Yusef Salam, who was 15, and Corey Wise, who was 16. All 5 boys were questioned for 7 hours without their parents, and 4 out of the 5 made confessions where the detectives had beaten them into confessing that they had actually done the crime, when there was so much evidence, including DNA samples, which proved that they weren't there and it wasn't them. They were then, as a result, they were sentenced to between 6 and 13 years in prison, with Corey Wise getting the biggest punishment as he was tried as an adult as he was 16. At the time of the trial and the sentencing, racial relations within New York City at the time were getting rougher and more violent, especially towards the families of the boys, as expected. But this also wasn't helped by Donald Trump at the time, who had donated $85,000, which is equivalent to around £135,000, on a full 4-page newspaper article which was titled "Bring Back the Death Penalty and Bring Back Our Police." He also did a CNN interview where he didn't show any sympathy towards the boys and said he didn't want to psychoanalyze them, he just wanted to punish them. He really wanted to hate those boys for what they had done, even though he had not really seen the evidence himself. Noughts and Crosses is a book series by Mallory Blackman in which the crosses are black people and seen as a superior race, and noughts, who are white people, are seen as the inferior race. And by turning the whole dynamic upside down, it makes you realise the small details of racial stereotyping that you don't necessarily see, and you see the race divide that has been created that has almost been permanently printed onto society. For example, the plaster colour, which is usually kind of a pale colour. In the book, a nought gets injured in the cross school and they're given a plaster which is quite dark toned. It's described to be that way in the book by Mallory Blackman, and it's one of the things that Sethi, who's one of the main characters in the book, doesn't realise, because she's a cross and doesn't see that. Because she's a cross, she doesn't realise the differences as much. But when she sees the plaster, it makes her think for the first time that there's a divide, and she's never really realised how bad it was. In the BBC series, the soldiers who have recently graduated from the military school are being welcomed into the army, and noughts and crosses can watch the event happen. However, when they go into the event, crosses go in on one side and don't have to go through any security checks, but the noughts go through on the other side and have to go through a metal detector check and be patted down as if they're in security in an airport. And it shows the trust that the crosses just don't have for the noughts because of previous examples of terrorism during the book, and the fact that they are just seen as tyrants and people who just want to make trouble. In the BBC series, you see a lot of black culture, and that's something that's really amazing that you don't really notice, because if you go to somewhere like the UK or America, you don't see people always wearing their traditional clothing, and that's something that I don't think is down to them doing it consciously sometimes. It's being part of the culture that they've moved into. What I find really interesting is how everyone's wearing it. Even the noughts are wearing everything that they're wearing, and it shows just how much the crosses have made an impact on the noughts and how they are better, so they have to wear their things. In The Guardian, there was an article about universities and their specific percentages of graduates in different subjects. The article was called "Can Universities Decolonize the Curriculum?" and it's talking about how different groups of students based on their race go for different subjects. in the article, Black, Asian and minority ethnicities are shown to make up 22.3% of master's graduates, and then 11.5% of humanities postgraduates, 8.6% of those are history and philosophy, and 9.2% are doing subjects in the arts. And these percentages rise significantly for subjects like business, law and medicine, and it can be down to two things, one of which is the history bias, which is usually Eurocentric, and it's where history you learn, especially up until university, is mainly based on European history. You go through World War One, World War Two, maybe the British royal system in the UK. You probably will do those, especially in primary school, because it's a really easy thing to learn, but you never really learn about other cultures, their history. Like, for example, you don't really learn about Aztecs, you don't really learn about the slave trade, you don't really learn about the Eastern world, the Chinese history, which are all really interesting topics to learn about in history. They're all very interesting, but you never really learn about it unless you make your own effort and learn about it yourself, which might turn BAME students away because you're not really learning about your own culture, you're just learning about one thing, when you really want to expand your knowledge in all areas, which might create that kind of bias. The second reason that this could be, the second reason that would bring these kind of statistics would be that BAME students are usually driven towards the more academic subjects, and that might be linked to the first reason, as in more academic subjects you don't see the racial bias as much. You learn about math. When you're learning about maths, it's just maths, there's no racial bias in it, and it's also because these BAME students are usually pushed towards the more academic subjects because they're seen as smarter, which is another stereotype which isn't necessarily seen as negative, but it can be if you're thinking, oh, these people are smart, which means they can't be doing humanities subjects. I also carried out a questionnaire within my school which I gave to my year group, and I wanted to explore to what extent racial stereotypes or stereotypes in general affected my year group and how they saw stereotypes as well. And I had 3 closed off questions that they had to answer within a scale, and 1 long answer question where they had to explain their answer, and 1 long answer question where they had to explain that answer and why they thought this. The first question is, to what extent do racial stereotypes still exist on a scale of 1 to 5? 1 being not at all and 5 being they're still prominently there. 27.6% of people said 3, 17.2% of people said 4, and 55.2% of people surveyed said 5. And I was really happy with that result because no one said 1 or 2, which means they're still quite aware that they're still there. A large majority of the people surveyed said 5, which means they recognise that they're still prominent and they're still here. The next question is, to what extent do racial stereotypes affect those being stereotyped? And 10.3% of people said 2, 13.8% of people said 3, and 24.1% of people said 4, and 51.7% of people said 5. This might be down to not ever really seeing to what extent. I don't think the question really covered what is considered as that person being affected by a racial stereotype. So that might have been why people went for 2, or they just might not have never seen it before. The majority of people still did go for 5, which is really good because it means that people are also aware of not just themselves but other people being affected by these stereotypes, which would make you think that they would hopefully do something if they saw someone being stereotyped, which is very nice to hear. The next question is, to what extent do racial stereotypes affect you? And 44.8% said 1, 27.6% said 2, 17.2% said 3, and 10.3% said 4. I was extremely happy with that because that means even though a lot, still 10.3%, which is quite a lot, are quite significantly impacted by the racial stereotypes, that a large majority, 44.8%, aren't affected at all. But an interesting thing that I would have wanted to look at for these results is the different ethnicities that answered the questions, because that would also lead me to see who exactly was getting racial stereotyped, because everyone can be. And would also be going not into detail but seeing how they experienced, what they actually experienced and when. The last question was, do you think negative stereotypes can be changed? And I'd wanted them to explain their answer to the question. Their first response was yes, but not easily, because negative stereotypes are passed down generations. We get told what certain people are like by our parents and grandparents, etc., and we are more likely to listen to family more than school if school tried to teach us differently. But despite this, I feel that if we could, it would have to be in primary school and secondary school, teaching us each week or so about stereotypes, which is a really nice answer, because it talks about how stereotypes are influenced by people we live with and grow up with, but it also can be changed by the education system, since we do also spend a lot of time there as well. The second response was, they are deep in the human system at this point in time after all the history. In today's society, there are still people who grew up in segregated areas and in societies where racism and stereotyping was expected. When these people have passed away, there may be a world without stereotyping, but then again, many countries still allow and accept stereotyping. I think we will be lucky if there is no more stereotyping in 100 years, but the most likely thing that will happen is that it will never go away. Even if one type of stereotype disappears, there will always be new ones to replace it. I found this answer also very interesting, because it opened up to the reasoning behind how there could be, but also looking at how there's so much damage already done that you can't really reverse it. And the last response was, possibly. The older generation carry these stereotypes more than the younger generation, so in a few years these stereotypes may be less signifying to people's lives. However, many young people still carry out racial stereotypes and racist acts because of their socialization and their parents' values, meaning this may have an impact on future generations. This one was very interesting as well as the other two, because it's talking about, again, the family relations and how people you live with and grow up with can impact your opinion, but also talking about the older generation and how they might carry these values more than the younger generation, who don't maybe not see these characteristics as much as the older generation. So that's also very interesting. Thank you for watching my EPQ video. Now that you've watched the video, I would like you to answer the post-video questionnaire, so I can for my last part of my EPQ, so I can evaluate those results as well. It's a very quick survey, won't take that long. Thank you for watching.